Thank you, Baltasar. So we're here to talk about cybersecurity, and we'll spend this entire time talking about that, so I won't get into it immediately. Just a few words about me. I'm the Senior Director of Threat Detection for Salesforce. My team is responsible for detecting attacks against Salesforce and Salesforce customers. I usually use gender-neutral pronouns, they, them, in English. Most people are not familiar with that yet. I write for the website Quora. I write quite a lot there, so I'll put a link at the end about big tech and computers, computer security management. So check me out there. You might find something interesting. Outside of work, I love running, especially very long distance trail running, also hiking, climbing, sailing, bicycling, basically anything active in the outdoors. So we'll take a step back to the highest level. What is computer security? Computer security, cybersecurity, this is according to Wikipedia, or information technology security is the protection of computer systems and networks from the theft of, this is really boring. What is computer security in human terms? Computer security is about protecting computers, networks, identities, and data from attacks. The most common is data theft, whether that's financial data like bank account and credit card information, or intellectual property, espionage, that sort of thing. We see remote control attacks turning computers into bots, typically in order to conduct some kind of a denial of service. We've also seen some tampering. Probably the most common is ransomware. Actually, certainly the most common is ransomware, where files are encrypted and then the attacker extorts money out of you to get your files back. But we've also seen attacks where data like financial data was manipulated in order to gain some advantage for the attacker. These are just some examples. Pretty much anything you can think of, somebody's done it somewhere. I probably don't need this slide. Most people understand why cybersecurity is important, but just in case you're doubting it, the market for cybersecurity products and services is over 140 billion euros. And that is not even including the costs of attacks that are successful. That is just the money people spend to try to prevent them and respond to them. And there are a lot that get through. Just in the first half of last year, 36 billion records were exposed in breaches. That's just a huge number. And really the only good news about that is so many records were exposed that many of them were probably duplicates. So even though 36 billion were exposed, a lot of those were the same people's information. So the addresses, the names were exposed multiple times. From a different perspective, the cybersecurity job market is absolutely incredible. We had 350% job growth over the past less than decade. And that shows up as a 0% unemployment rate. There's literally no one in this field who goes unemployed for any extended amount of time when they want to be working. And we see that as managers. When I try to hire someone, it's very difficult. And in fact, globally, there are 4 million unfilled jobs. So we can't hire nearly as many people as we want to. And to make it very personal, your own data has probably, I would like to say definitely, but our PR folks might not appreciate that. Your data has probably been stolen many times over, not through any fault of your own, but because so many large organizations that do business with huge numbers of people have been breached. If you were on LinkedIn, some of your data was breached from LinkedIn when that company was breached. All sorts of payment providers, banks. So sorry to tell you, if you didn't realize this already, your data is probably already out there. Cybersecurity is an interesting field in that it's highly specialized, even more so than other aspects of computers. So we'll talk about a few of the specialties, and then we'll get in depth into my specialty. So application security is all about vulnerabilities. This is what some people think of when they think computer security. It's about finding those zero-day exploits in your own product or in someone else's. You could do that to make your product more secure, to help someone else make theirs more secure, or potentially to sell what you find for a bug bounty. You can make a living just on finding vulnerabilities. There's an aspect that has a few different names often called protection or controls. This is another thing you might think of when you think IT security. It's about configuring systems and networks so that they're harder to attack, setting proper permissions, putting firewalls in place, putting multi-factor authentication in place, password complexity requirements, a whole host of things designed to make it hard for attacks to succeed in the first place. A field many folks are less familiar with is compliance. Compliance is about verifying that some organization is secure as defined by some regulation or standards. So, for example, before an organization can process credit card data or bank account data, it needs to comply with a regulation called Pci Dss, which is established by the payment card industry, the folks who make the credit cards and the credit card networks. They want to be sure that websites that host credit card data aren't too easy to hack. And so they have a standard that you need to prove that you meet that standard before you can host that data. And there are lots and lots of these different standards. By the way, I use the word hack to mean an attack against computer systems, just because it's a short word that has that meaning. I know it has several other meanings, but in this presentation, when I say hack, I mean to attack a computer system. So apologies to those who don't like that usage. Threat intelligence, another aspect of the industry that many people don't even realize exists. Threat intelligence tracks attacker groups over time to identify their behaviors. So these are the people who tell you that this attack was conducted by the Cozy Bear attack group, and the Cozy Bear group is linked to this particular government, and their behaviors include they use this kind of exploit and that kind of malware, and they typically attack these types of victims. And by linking all of those things together, we can get a picture of who the attackers are, why they're doing what they're doing, and then as defenders, what we can do to prevent them from being successful against us. A category almost everyone knows, red team. Red team are the hackers we pay to hack ourselves so that we can find and fix the problems. They do the same things that the bad people do, only we give them permission. They have some rules so that they don't cause real damage, and then they tell us afterwards what we missed. Blue team is going to be the topic of focus for today. Blue team is everything that happens after an attacker starts attacking. So that's detecting them, doing forensics to figure out what they did, and doing incident response to deal with whatever they did. You can broadly think of this as all of the kinds of defense that you play when there's a real attacker out there trying to do something to you. Breaking those down further, detection is my team. Our job is to find the attackers. When an attack happens, the attackers leave behind traces of their activity in log data, and we look for those traces. And we'll get into a little bit what that looks like. We also investigate the alerts to determine which ones are for real attacks. It's very difficult to find these traces by somebody who's trying not to leave any tracks behind. So when we go looking, we often find ghosts, things that aren't really there, false positive alerts. And so we also need to look through the alerts that we produce to figure out which of them are actually real and which are not. Digital forensics, these are the folks who pull hard drives out of computers and recover data that the attacker tried to delete. It's about figuring out what happened. And they literally take phones apart, like the way it's pictured here, although getting into phone data is considerably harder than getting into laptop, desktop, server data. An incident response, their job is to make it all better. So once the detection and forensics folks have figured out what happened, incident response figures out what we should do about that, whether it's fixing a vulnerability, shutting down some systems, or freezing accounts, providing some kind of public notification, and coordinating all of those actions so that nothing gets screwed up. That's incident response. Okay, so now let's walk you through a day in the life of a blue team. This is a hypothetical day. These are not real events, and most days are not like this. This would be a very unusual day, and things that would typically take place over multiple days are being compressed into one. But that said, this is fairly realistic of what will actually happen to a blue team. So we start our day in the usual way. And a detection engineer thinks to herself, an attacker might try a brute force attack, and they might do that just by repeatedly trying to log in with different guessed passwords. Most of those would fail, So we could look for that. We could look for a series of failed login attempts. Okay, so let's fuel up again and try to figure out how to implement this. And here's what we came up with. This probably doesn't mean anything to you, maybe if you speak Splunk. This is a query in the Splunk Query language. Splunk is a system that's commonly used to search through log files. It will help you find the needle in the proverbial haystack, which may not translate, I realize. It can help you find those very small bits of data you're looking for out of very large bits of data. There are other systems other than Splunk that do the same thing. I'm most familiar with Splunk. It's very common in the industry, so that's what we're using as the example today. So let me break this down for you. First, we're going to search through all available data. That means index equals star. We're going to look in Windows security logs, and we're going to look for all kinds of actions marked fail. We're going to group those together by time into one-day buckets. And then we're going to count how many times each user, source, and time tuple appears. So we have, and then we're going to add up those counts per user. And then we're going to sort it. So the end result of that is going to be a sorted list of the users with the most failed logon attempts for each day. So we've crafted our query. Let's hit run and see what happens. Wow, okay. So we see a really interesting pattern here. We've got a bunch of users who probably typoed their password once and then that's it. So that's not very interesting. We have a few users who have a moderately high number of failed login accounts, whether that's someone who completely forgot their password or someone got a hold of their computer. But we don't really see like a huge number. But then we have this H. Potter account with a huge number of failed login attempts. There's no way that this is something the user is doing themselves. Nobody typos their password 537 times. So let's see what else we can figure out. Yeah. Okay, we know we've got something bad going on. So let's get ready. Let's do it. Let's get really ready. It's going to be one of those days. So now we're going to start running some queries to start figuring out what happened. So in this case, we're going to look in our IDS index. We're going to look for login connections identified by IDS, and we're going to look for connections to the destination account, H. Potter. For folks who aren't familiar, IDS stands for Intrusion Detection System. It's typically a network device that gets a copy of every packet sent on the network and records key data about those packets. So for example, it will record for every connection the source and destination IP address and port, and the amount of traffic that was exchanged between those two. It can also capture individual packets for later storage. Lots of interesting things about IDS that we don't have time to get into today. Another interesting fact that I'm going to use in the next slide, even though the IDS only sees IP addresses, it doesn't have any idea what's on the other end of those. But we as defenders have some tricks that we can use to turn an IP address into a host name. If it's a host on our own network, we can use our DHCP logs to figure out which host name was assigned to a particular IP address by DHCP if our network's configured that way. We can also look at DNS records. So if we know that the workstation or the username myworkstation.ourcompany.com was assigned to the IP address 1.2.3.4 at a particular time, well, then we know that if we see 1.2.3.4 at that particular time, that equates to the My Workstation host name. So, and we have some other ways that we can figure these things out as well. So now we get our results and we see, okay, we have two hosts all trying to log into this H. Potter account, and they're doing it, you can look at the timestamps, about once a second we're getting an attempt. So this is interesting because if it were one host attempting to log in, that could be a buggy script, someone trying to log in repeatedly, and it's just stuck in a retry loop failing. And if we had a bunch of hosts, that could be a buggy script that got distributed very broadly. But in this case, we see there are only two hosts, this El Voldemort and Death Eater, trying to log into the H. Potter account. And That's very suspicious. This seems like something that maybe is happening intentionally. So now we're going to look into this a little bit more. Looking at our assets database, which is our database of computers, we're going to see what information we can turn up about this El Voldemo or Death Eater host. Okay, well, some basic information. These are both owned by the same user, username El Voldemo. Now, I should say that all of these queries we're running here, these are something that the user came up, the investigator came up with themselves. So it's not like we're automatically running through this entire list. It's I as an investigator, I see some data. I've seen some data before in this case. I'm trying to figure out what's going on. So I come up with questions that I want to ask, and then I ask them using these queries. Okay, so now we know we have this user, El Voldemo. What else can we find out? So we're going to go to our HR database, and we're going to look up employee information for this user. And we see some interesting things here. So this user was terminated. So this person no longer works for our organization. They were terminated in 2007, so they haven't worked here for quite some time. And they're marked as not eligible for rehire. That indicates that the user was probably terminated, or maybe they quit ahead of being terminated, fired. So that's also a sign that maybe this user is not trustworthy, or that they might have some reason to take malicious action against our organization because they didn't leave on good terms. And by the way, there are a lot of things that are oversimplified here, and normally a user, one of our investigators would not have direct access to the HR database. That's too sensitive, but I'm simplifying for purposes of presentation. So the next thing we're going to do is take an image of the disk. It's a very simple command that you can run. Actually, FTK Imager is publicly available. You can try this out yourself. And this command will preserve an exact copy of the hard disk, bit for bit. And that's really important for two main reasons. Number one, this machine right now is still online, and that means things are happening on its disk. The attacker could very well try to overwrite log files, could even reformat the hard drive and try to erase all data. And even though we're good at recovering data, there are also programs out there that can securely wipe your disk to the point that we can't recover it. So the first reason we capture disk is it gives us something that is perfectly static. We can do all of the analysis we want on our copy of the disk and be sure that nothing is ever going to change. And if we screw it up, we can go back to that original copy that we made. The second reason why it's important to take a sound forensic snapshot of the disk is someday we might need to use this in a trial. And if we do go to court, we'll want the investigator to be able to get up on the witness stand and say, I copied this hard drive at this time, and I examined it. And because of the way that I copied it, because it's exactly identical, what I was looking at is really what was there. In the past, in the US and other countries, there have been challenges that in the investigation process, the investigator might have modified the data, and so the data is not trustworthy. But through this method, we can say, here's this disk that I copied. It is exactly the way it was at the moment I copied it. Actually, in some cases, if we physically pull a hard drive, that may get introduced into the legal evidence, into the record. And this works, even though there are differences across countries, most countries with fully developed computer security laws have a similar standard of evidence and similar practices. The truth is you rarely get to actually go to court. Typically, if it's an employee action, the company is not likely to want that to become so public as a trial. And if it's a criminal action, typically the criminals are in a jurisdiction that's hard for you to reach, whether it's a country you don't have an extradition treaty with, maybe they're don't have a friendly relationship with your country. But every so often things do go to trial, and so you need to be ready for that. Okay, so now that we've pulled this disk, we have the decision to make. We don't always want to pull the plug on a computer that's attacking some part of our network. It can be very valuable to watch what happens. So sometimes we'll leave a compromised computer on and monitor it very closely, and we can see, what does the attacker do from there? Are they connecting to other systems? Are they using other accounts? Are they installing malware? Sometimes we'll even see them come to the search engine, like the company or organization's search engine, and start looking for whatever it is they're looking for, just the same way an employee would look for that. And so by watching their searches, we can see what their mission goal is. And based on that, we can look more closely at the systems that they might like to compromise, or potentially even take data offline to prevent compromise. But we don't always do that, because if the attacker is actively causing damage, if they're accessing a user system, if they're accessing user data, if they're tampering with things, that we can't let continue. So in this case, because we see that the attacker has launched this apparently successful brute force attack, we're going to pull the plug and cut off the attacker's access. So now we're going to go back to that login connections database, and we're going to look up for connections to the El Voltimo account and see who's been connected to that account. And we find a single connection from a host address given by an IP address. So this is an external IP address, not part of our organization. So now let's take another step. Let's look at the El Voltimo account and see if we can figure something out. Because this user was terminated, how is this account still active? Well, it is. The user account is still active. And what happened is we terminated this user, but we forgot to terminate their account. So this user has still been able to log into our network, even though they're no longer employed by the company. This is actually a really common problem. Many organizations revoking login credentials is a manual action. So somehow the person who is the manager who's overseeing the termination has to contact HR to disable, or has to contact the IT department to disable the account, and the person in IT has to actually do it. So we actually see this all the time, where users who have left the company still have their credentials active. Not necessarily even that they're using those as we have here, but just it's a very common problem that people retain their ability to access networks after they've been terminated. Okay, so now we're going to go to our email records, and we're going to see what the attacker did. So we're going to look for API accesses to the account hpotter. Okay, so some interesting stuff here. We've got the same IP address that we saw before, connecting repeatedly to the hpotter account and triggering the email download API. And we see them transferring 25 megabyte chunks, almost all at once. And you can see that the timestamps are almost identical. So some interesting questions here. We don't know what the attacker is downloading. We can guess that they're probably downloading the user's email, but we don't really know that. It's possible that they're downloading a single large attachment repeatedly. It's entirely possible that this was supposed to be some kind of a backup job that is failing. But most likely they're stealing email. We can jump to that conclusion. We also notice that they're transferring 25 megabytes. Why is that? Well, we don't really know, but there's some things we could guess. Maybe that's the size that the API returns. Every time you call email download, you get 25 megabytes of data. You just have to keep calling it to get more. It could be that is the value the attacker specified in their download script. It could be that the attacker script is running in a tight loop, downloading data, and 25 megabytes just happens to be the size that they picked. You have to pick some number, maybe 25 is it. It could also be an intentional choice, because the attacker might think, hey, if I download 5 or 10 gigabytes of data all at once, well, somebody's probably going to notice that. Users don't do that very often. But if I download only 25 megabytes at once, that's not very much data. Maybe nobody will notice. On the other hand, we might notice that there are tons and tons of requests. So as an attacker, you have to try and figure out which thing you're most afraid of. But in this case, it looks like the attacker went for repeated small downloads. We may never know why that was the case. Okay, so we have a pretty clear picture now of what happened. So let's tell the head of our organization. Putting it all together, we had a successful brute force attack against the hpotter account from the El Voltimo and Death Eater machines, both machines owned by the same user who's no longer with our organization. The attacker exfiltrated the contents of the user's inbox. We haven't seen anything else, and we pulled the plug on those machines. We're not done with our investigation, so we'll come back with further updates. So In this presentation, we blazed through all of that in about 10 minutes. In real life, that would probably have taken days and days of work as we explore ideas that don't pan out as we run queries that return nothing of interest. Okay, end of the day, this is one person's coffee output. So let's talk a little bit about jobs in the field and how they relate to you. There's some really good reasons to be a blue teamer. If you like playing games with data, if the idea of looking at big data sets and trying to figure out what's going on is exciting to you, you might like blue team. If you like excitement, that is definitely what we have. I joined my first blue team because I wanted to be excited at work, and I was not disappointed. It is very exciting. If you like to work on short-term projects with lots of variety, blue team is for you. We don't tend to work on things that take a long time. We tend to have a new project every few days, every few weeks, and then move on to something else. The last interesting thing about being a blue teamer, attractive to some people, is working on things that are in the news. I have worked on dozens and dozens of incidents that were related to news, sometimes related to very prominent news that I've had my parents, my relatives, and people in my life who really don't have anything to do with computers asking me about something that they read. And yes, I was working on that. If you like to tell stories at parties, you will get some good ones. You will not be able to tell all of your stories, but you'll be able to tell some of them. On the other hand, there are some things that might make you not want to be a blue teamer. If you like building things that last, blue team is probably not for you. We don't do that. We're a short-term, get in, fix it, move on. If you like following rules, blue team and really most of security is probably not for you. Our job involves thinking like attackers, thinking about where the rules can be broken, where the rules can be bent. And as a defender, we're trying to get ahead of attackers, figure out where they might be bending rules and look for them there. That said, in the compliance field, rules are very important. So if you like security, but also rules, compliance might be for you, but not blue team. If you like having predictable work, blue team, definitely not for you. 95% of the time when you come into work, you're going to go home on schedule, but things happen. Sometimes you find an attacker, or you find something that looks like an attacker, or someone else finds an attacker and you have to deal with it, and you don't come home on time. You might not be home on time for a week. So if you like predictable schedules, blue team is probably not for you. The last thing is, when you work for a blue team, if you succeed, probably nobody finds out about it. Most of the time, if you catch the attacker early, it's just not a big deal. You've caught them. They didn't do anything wrong. You might send some email to senior managers in your organization, but that's it. On the other hand, if you fail, that's very visible. If your company is compromised and all of your data winds up on the internet and you're on the front page of every newspaper in the world, that is extremely visible. So you have to be okay with that lack of visibility for the good things and very high visibility for the bad things if you want to be on blue team. There are a couple of paths to get into this field. The easiest path is to go to college, study computer science or IT or something similar, and I understand a lot of you are already doing that. And while you're there, take security courses that are available to you. If you don't have that option, but you do have the option to write a thesis, focus your thesis on security. And you can also do security work on the side. That could be writing blog posts, analyzing malware, finding vulnerabilities, participating in capture the flag competitions, even just going to conferences. All of those things will help you become qualified, and then you apply for jobs the normal way. At many larger companies, there won't be a specific process for applying for security jobs. You'll have to just apply for a generic software engineering or IT job, and then specify that you're interested in security, and typically the recruiters will route you towards those positions. I mentioned we have 3 million unfilled positions globally. So if you say you're interested in security and you have some skills, usually it's pretty easy to get connected into those jobs. There is a second path. If you're not able to get into security right out of college, you can get any job, any security or IT job, and volunteer to work on security projects. There are typically lots of them in the organization. Most people don't really know about them, and a lot of people don't have any interest in getting involved. So if you sign up for those, you'll generally be able to get assigned them. You can also supplement with security courses, with certification courses. I don't think most of them are very valuable. I do like the OSCP certification, that's my personal opinion, but they're not necessary, and many of them are not really worth that much. Once you have all that experience, it should be easy to move laterally within your organization or another one into a security-focused position. You acquire the knowledge you need on the job. But of course, the best way to become a blue teamer is to wait for my team to post a position, apply, and come work for me, because my team is the best. Thank you very much for coming to my talk. You can find me on LinkedIn. You can find me on Quora. And I think we have some time now for questions.